Africa. They're talking about government advocacy. When you look at it on paper, it all looks really good, but they're actually wolf in sheep's clothing.
They say some speeches make you think, but this one will make you wake up. When Dr. Arikana Chihombori-Quao stood on that stage and said, "The United Nations doesn't want you to hear this," it wasn't a warning. It was a declaration of war on lies that have shaped how the world sees Africa. With a voice that shakes both empires and illusions, she tears apart the glossy mask of foreign aid, exposing how kindness became a weapon and charity became control. Every word feels like truth finally breaking free from centuries of silence. This isn't just another talk about Africa, it's a spiritual earthquake, a call to every African to stop asking for permission to exist. Because once you hear her words, you can't unhear them. You don't just listen to Dr. Arikana, you feel her. And when she's done, you will never see the world the same again. Let's get into it. It always starts the same way. A tragedy, a headline, a tear-jerking photo. The world rushes in with sympathy, donations pour through the internet, and soon, planes begin landing across African skies. Out of them step smiling men and women in branded jackets, holding clipboards and cameras, claiming they've come to help. The world cheers, applauds, and calls it humanity at its best. But Dr. Arikana Chihombori-Quao asks the question no one dares to. Help who and for what? Because beneath those white tents and press releases lies something darker, something calculated. These are not just rescuers, they are scouts. They come to observe, to map, to record, and to prepare. They arrive with good intentions on their lips, but with economic interests in their briefcases. They know where the minerals lie, which region holds lithium, which river can power a dam, and which forest sits on untapped oil. Aid becomes a passport, a legal excuse to enter areas no investor, no politician, and sometimes no soldier could reach. Once there, they don't just distribute supplies, they collect data, information that later feeds corporate boardrooms thousands of miles away. Dr. Arikana calls them what
We need to understand the real reason why USAID is in Africa. And not just USAID, but other NGOs. You look at DFID, which is the British equivalent, and many other smaller ones. Their sole purpose was to act as if they're coming to rescue Africa. They're coming to fill in the gaps in government services, gaps in education, gaps in healthcare, gaps in humanitarian services. They're coming in the guise of addressing issues to do with human rights, issues to do with environmental protection and social justice. They are coming in claiming that they're introducing grassroots initiatives that are going to help the people. And so they use that as a way to go into the most remote parts of Africa. They're talking about government advocacy. When you look at it on paper, it all looks really good, but they're actually wolf in sheep's clothing.
they are, wolves in humanitarian clothing. She exposes how foreign aid and NGOs have evolved into the most powerful form of soft colonization. They no longer come with chains, she says. They come with clipboards. Instead of forcing their way in with armies, they infiltrate through empathy. They call it humanitarian access. But access to whom and at what cost? They use kindness as a key, but behind that door lies Africa's sovereignty. And here's the brutal irony. These organizations have existed for over half a century. They've held summits, produced glossy reports, and built offices in every capital. So where are the results? Why does the African child they helped 30 years ago have a child today still needing the same help? Why are the same problems recycled with new names? Poverty reduction, sustainable development, inclusive growth. The faces in the photos change, the donors change, but the conditions remain hauntingly the same. Dr. Arikana exposes the truth the world pretends not to see. Aid is not about solving problems. It's about preserving them. Every ongoing crisis justifies another round of funding, another project, another job for another consultant. The poorer Africa looks, the more valuable it becomes to the aid industry. It's not charity, it's business. A business that needs poverty to survive. And still the world calls them saviors. They are celebrated in international forums, given awards for humanitarian excellence, and treated like global heroes. Meanwhile, Africans remain in the background, the story, never the storytellers. This is how a continent becomes both the stage and the product in someone else's theater of virtue. Dr. Arikana's anger is not just political, it's personal. Because she's seen firsthand how aid destroys initiative, how it convinces bright young Africans that progress must come from abroad, not from within. She says, "They teach our children that help comes from outside, not from their own hands." And that's how dependency is born, not through poverty, but through psychology. Her words hit like lightning. If they are truly helping, then where are the results? The silence that follows is heavier than applause. Because deep down, everyone knows the answer. The results don't exist because they were never meant to. And that realization burns. It raises the question that leads to everything else. If aid has failed for decades, why are we still letting it in? Why are we still opening the door to the very wolves we keep calling friends?
A little good is coming out, but by and large, the end result, they mean no good. They can turn around and give us an inventory and say, as long as you have been in Africa, and also other parts of the world, show us your success rate. You claim you are helping governments with education and healthcare. Show us your success rate.
Dr. Arikana doesn't ask that question as a cynic. She asks it as someone who has seen behind the curtain. She knows the numbers, the budgets, the missions, and the speeches. And she knows they all share one thing in common: endless promises with invisible results. For decades, Africa has been the world's biggest recipient of development aid, yet it remains the poorest continent by design. The aid system, she says, is not broken. It's working exactly as intended. Every few years, a new campaign emerges. End hunger by 2020, Africa rising, the Sustainable Development Agenda. Billions of dollars are pledged, press conferences held, and documentaries filmed, and for a brief moment, it looks like progress. But when the dust settles, the story remains the same. The hospitals are still underfunded, the roads still cracked, and the schools still overcrowded. Where does the money go? Dr. Arikana doesn't hesitate. It circles back to where it came from. 80% of what's called aid to Africa never actually reaches Africa. It pays Western salaries, funds Western logistics, and hires Western consultants who advise African governments on how to fix problems those same Western systems helped create. She calls it the mirage of results, development that exists only on paper. Reports are written in air-conditioned offices in Paris or Geneva, full of colorful graphs showing progress. Yet, if you travel to the villages those reports claim to have helped, you'll find the same dusty wells, the same unpaved roads, and the same hunger. It's a cruel illusion of change, one that satisfies donors but leaves Africans exactly where they started. And here's where she strikes deeper. Aid, she says, has never been about compassion. It's been about control. The system is structured to keep Africa dependent, not independent. Every dollar that comes in creates 10 more reasons why Africa supposedly can't survive without foreign help. That's why donor agencies love long-term projects. They ensure permanent relevance. No one ever wants Africa to graduate from aid. They want it to keep enrolling. Dr. Arikana compares the system to a doctor who never heals his patient because his income depends on the illness. They feed you enough to survive, she says, but never enough to stand. And the psychological effect is devastating. Africans grow up hearing that the continent is developing, as though it's permanently stuck in adolescence, never mature, never complete, always dependent. That's not a coincidence, that's conditioning. And still, despite this pattern, African leaders keep welcoming the same organizations back. They hold ribbon-cutting ceremonies for donated clinics while signing away mineral rights for a fraction of their worth. They let foreign consultants write national strategies while their own universities are underfunded. Why? Because foreign approval has become the new badge of success. A leader praised by the West feels validated even if his people remain hungry. Dr. Arikana shakes her head at the irony. You can't mismanage what you never controlled, she says. It's one of her most piercing lines, a reminder that Africans are often blamed for failures engineered from the outside. The aid system is not a bridge to prosperity, it's a leash disguised as a gift. And so, she asks again, not in anger, but in disbelief. If this system has failed for 60 years, why do African governments still open their doors to it? Why does a continent that built empires before colonization still act like it needs permission to stand? Why are African leaders still trusting the same hands that keep them tied down? This is where Dr. Arikana's voice takes a sharp turn, from exposing the outsiders to confronting the insiders. The question she poses cuts right to the core of Africa's political soul. Why do African governments keep letting them in? Why are the same players, the same organizations, the same manipulators still welcomed with red carpets and photo ops? Her tone isn't bitter, it's surgical. She's not pointing fingers to shame, she's diagnosing an illness that has infected the continent's leadership for generations, the illness of dependency.
So turn around and say, African governments, why do you need this little aid to assist you in providing proper health care, proper education? The average African government can afford to provide those services
She calls
for
it
their people.
The invisible colony, one that doesn't rule through guns or chains, but through minds and habits. After independence, Africa removed the colonial flags but not the colonial programming. The colonizers left physically, but their teachings stayed behind, embedded in the systems, institutions, and thought processes of those who took power. Dr. Arikana explains that the greatest success of colonialism wasn't territorial conquest, it was mental conquest. The idea that progress must come from the West became gospel. And because of that lie, even now, African leaders often feel that sovereignty needs supervision. This mentality shows up everywhere. When Western consultants visit African ministries, they're treated like sages. Their words become policy, even when they know nothing about the local realities. But when African scholars, economists, or engineers propose homegrown solutions, they're ignored or underfunded. Why? Because their solutions don't carry foreign branding. Dr. Arikana sighs at this irony. We have convinced ourselves that unless an idea is stamped by the West, it isn't legitimate. That's not governance, she says. That's mental colonization disguised as development. And it's not only governments. It's also the educated elite, the policymakers, the technocrats, the think tank analysts who speak in donor language instead of African truth. They sit in meetings quoting the IMF and the World Bank as if they were sacred texts, forgetting that those very institutions built their wealth by impoverishing the South. Our leaders are fluent in the language of dependency, she says, and that's the tragedy. The continent's future is being managed by people who believe their validation comes from abroad. Dr. Arikana's frustration is palpable because she knows Africa has everything it needs to stand tall. It has talent, land, youth, and innovation. What it lacks is the will to trust itself. You can't call yourself independent, she says, if every decision needs a donor's signature. True independence isn't declared on paper, it's practiced in policy. Until Africa stops waiting for external permission, it will keep living in the shadow of its own potential. She doesn't just blame leaders, she challenges citizens too. Africans, she says, must stop glorifying the foreign and start believing in their own. When an African succeeds, we look for the Western connection. When a Westerner fails, we look for the African to blame. That mentality keeps Africa frozen in place. And then comes her sharpest question yet, the one that silences the hall. If Africa once rebuilt Europe after the war, if it provided the resources that powered global prosperity, then why does it now act like a continent waiting to be rescued? The audience shifts, uneasy, because she's right. The same Africa that fed empires now feeds on aid. The same nations that financed the Industrial Revolution are now called developing. It's not poverty, she insists. It's programmed humility. So the question becomes not why is Africa poor, but who taught Africa to believe it must stay that way? And that question opens the door to the next revelation, one that flips history upside down. If Africa helped the world recover, how did the world convince Africa that it needed saving? Let's pause for a second to say big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. Now comes the part where Dr. Arikana stops asking questions and starts tearing history apart, piece by piece. Let's tell the truth, she says, her voice steady but sharp. Africa didn't beg Europe to rise. Europe begged Africa to survive. And that's the kind of statement that makes you stop breathing for a second. Because when you trace the world's economic recovery after World War II, the story you're told in Western textbooks is that Europe rebuilt itself through discipline, hard work, and the Marshall Plan. But what those books don't mention, what Dr. Arikana shouts from the rooftops, is that the Marshall Plan itself would have been meaningless without Africa's resources.
But what they don't tell you is that Africa, through exploitation of its resources by the Europeans, was actually a much, much bigger contribution to the European recovery post-World War II. Nobody talks about that. Why does such a continent that did so much to help Europe recover continue to be so poor? Let's be realistic here. Let's not talk.
The uranium from the Congo powered America's atomic age. The copper from Zambia rebuilt European infrastructure. The gold from Ghana and South Africa kept Western currencies stable. The oil from Nigeria, Angola, and Libya fueled industries across the world. The cocoa, coffee, and cotton that poured out of Africa rebuilt factories, economies, and entire lifestyles abroad. And yet, when Europe recovered, Africa didn't receive thanks. It received debt. The very continent that gave so much was told it owed more. Dr. Arikana calls this reparations in reverse. The exploited became the debtor, and the thief became the creditor. The World Bank and the IMF, both created during that same post-war era, became the new instruments of colonial control. Loans were offered under the banner of development, but each loan came with fine print: privatize your industries, open your markets, cut subsidies, reduce social spending. It was economic warfare disguised as assistance. Africa didn't borrow to grow, it borrowed to obey. And the irony doesn't end there. After decades of resource extraction, after centuries of looting, the same powers that benefited from Africa's minerals returned wearing halos, this time with the language of aid and capacity building. The colonizer had rebranded as the savior. But as Dr. Arikana says with cutting precision, a parasite doesn't change because it smiles. It changes because the host wakes up. What she means is simple. The West's relationship with Africa isn't rooted in compassion. It's rooted in control. She reminds her audience that the idea of a helpless Africa was deliberately manufactured. It justified the West's continued presence on African soil. After all, if the patient keeps needing treatment, the doctor never leaves. They made Africa the patient, she says, and themselves the eternal healer. It's a psychological trick. Convince a powerful continent that it's weak, and it will keep buying your strength forever. Then she drops the line that defines her entire argument. Africa doesn't need aid. It needs the exploitation to stop. The crowd erupts, but she doesn't smile. She knows applause doesn't change reality. What she wants is for Africans to understand that every act of aid that looks generous often masks a deeper extraction. Every hospital built by donors sits near a mine owned by their corporations. Every charity initiative is funded by profits made from African resources sold abroad. Her words slice through the illusion. If the helper gains more than the helped, is he really a helper or a parasite? The question echoes like thunder. And then she adds, if the West takes more than it gives, what is Africa truly getting from this relationship? That moment feels like a turning point, because the audience realizes this isn't about pity anymore. It's about justice. And justice, as she reminds them, doesn't come from outside saviors. It begins with recognition, the moment people finally see who's eating from their plate. That's when you start asking the most dangerous question of all. If this has been happening for decades, how much longer will Africa trade its gold for peanuts? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video, and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now.
Look at what is being brought in by not only USAID, but all the NGOs in your country. It's peanuts. It's It's a joke that the African leaders should continue to be beggars of peanuts when you are looking and allowing billions to get out of your country year in and year out, if not trillions, in natural resources that your people should be benefiting.
When Dr. Arikana calls it the peanut economy, she isn't exaggerating for effect. She's describing a brutal reality. Her voice carries that quiet anger that only comes from truth. For every $1 billion Africa receives in so-called aid, at least 10 billion leaves in the opposite direction. The continent gives the world its minerals, its oil, its coffee, its cobalt, its timber, and even its youth. Yet in return, it receives symbolic handouts dressed as generosity. They bring peanuts, she says, and we give them gold. And somehow, Africa is expected to say thank you. The imbalance is absurd once you stop to see it. Western nations extract Africa's raw materials at dirt-cheap prices, ship them abroad, refine them, and then sell them back to Africa at premium cost. The continent ends up paying for its own resources twice, first through extraction, then through consumption. And to make the scam look noble, the same powers send back a fraction of their profit as aid. It's like stealing a man's meal and then tossing him the crumbs as charity. Dr. Arikana says it plainly, aid isn't a gift. It's a refund with interest unpaid. She draws an even sharper picture when she talks about the hidden costs of those peanuts. Food aid, for instance, sounds harmless until you see what it does to local farmers. Imported wheat floods the market, undercuts African growers, and bankrupts once self-sufficient communities. Free clothing from Western donors wipes out domestic textile industries. Every time you thank them for what they give, she says, you're losing something you already had. It's not generosity, it's disruption. Aid arrives like medicine, but acts like poison. Even the scholarships and development programs have a hidden edge. The brightest African students are taken abroad, educated in foreign systems, and absorbed into global corporations, rarely returning home. They don't just take our gold, she says bitterly. They take our minds. And those who do return often find themselves dismissed, blocked, or disillusioned by governments that have learned to trust outside consultants more than their own citizens. Dr. Arikana calls this the architecture of dependence, a system that trains Africa to celebrate survival while exporting prosperity. Western media reinforce it by showing Africans as victims, never as innovators. The world's charity narrative thrives on Africa's misrepresentation. If you change how Africa is seen, she warns, you change how Africa is treated, and that terrifies them. Her words hit hardest when she turns the lens inward. We are the ones clapping for crumbs, she says. We are the ones mistaking pity for partnership. She reminds the audience that a continent that feeds the world shouldn't beg for food, and a continent that powers modern technology shouldn't plead for loans. The only reason Africa accepts peanuts is that it has been convinced that peanuts are all it deserves. She pauses for a moment, scanning the crowd. You can feel the silence, that kind of silence where realization starts to hurt. Then she asks, almost softly, what would happen if we stopped begging? It's a dangerous question because it challenges an entire global structure built on dependency. What if Africa stopped waiting for donors, stopped exporting raw materials, and started building its own wealth? What if it refused the crumbs and demanded its share of the feast? Her message is clear. The day Africa stops mistaking exploitation for help is the day the world economy changes. Because Africa isn't poor, it's priced low. Its labor, land, and potential have been undervalued for generations, and aid is the tool that keeps it that way. But that illusion only lasts as long as Africans believe it. And as Dr. Arikana leans forward, the air feels heavy with awakening. If we stopped looking outward for help and started looking inward for strength, would Africa finally rise?
Her hoping that this will translate into African leaders looking from within, because they don't really need to keep looking outside. They have what it takes. It's a wake-up call, just like what happened during COVID. It was a wake-up call for African leaders to realize that you must begin to look within Africa to take care of it.
Tone changes, calm, resolute, almost spiritual. She's no longer dismantling systems. She's rebuilding belief. Africa doesn't need saving, she says quietly. It needs remembering. That single line carries the weight of centuries. Because what she's really saying is this: Africa's power didn't disappear. It was buried, hidden under layers of propaganda, poverty narratives, and psychological warfare. And the world has done everything possible to make sure Africa forgets who it is. She reminds her audience that Africa was never a dark continent. It was dimmed on purpose. Long before colonization, it had functioning economies, empires, libraries, and trade routes that connected the entire globe. Timbuktu wasn't just a legend, she says. It was the Silicon Valley of its time. Before Europe industrialized, African kingdoms like Mali, Benin, and Kush were building cities with complex governance systems and social order. Even Ethiopia, she notes, stood as the only African nation that defeated colonization head-on. Our ancestors weren't waiting for aid, she says. They were creating civilizations. But what colonialism couldn't destroy physically, it attacked mentally. It replaced pride with shame, knowledge with dependence, and identity with imitation. Dr. Arikana calls this the longest-running war in history, the war for the African mind. We're free on paper, she says, but chained in belief. Every time an African child is taught that greatness comes from the West, another generation is subdued. Every time an African leader bows for aid, the chains tighten. It's not the kind of slavery you can see. It's the kind you accept. That's why, for her, the real revolution isn't about guns or protests. It's about awakening. We must wake up, she declares, because we already have everything the world needs: the land, the people, the minerals, the spirit, and yet, we act like we have nothing. It's the contradiction of abundance living in fear. She challenges the youth in particular, reminding them that they are the most powerful generation in modern African history. With technology, connectivity, and education, they hold tools their ancestors never had. But if they use them to imitate others instead of inventing their own path, then Africa will stay stuck in someone else's story. She envisions a new kind of Africa, not one obsessed with foreign validation, but one that defines success in African terms. Imagine a continent that educates its children in its own languages, trades with its own neighbors using its own currency, and governs without asking permission from foreign powers. We don't need another savior, she says. We need self-respect. And the audience knows she's right, because self-respect is what the world has tried hardest to strip away. Dr. Arikana's words are not just advice. They are prophecy. She believes the next chapter of Africa will not be written in boardrooms or by global institutions. It will be written by Africans who refuse to be silent. The world fears an Africa that remembers itself, she says, because that Africa won't ask, it will act. And she paints the picture vividly: nations trading freely, inventors creating globally competitive industries, artists reshaping the world's culture, and leaders guided not by donors, but by dignity. She ends the way only she can, not with fire, but with faith. The key has always been in our hands, but we just stopped believing we could turn it. If Africa truly holds the key to its destiny, will it finally turn the lock? How long will we keep calling it aid when it keeps us dependent? Let us know in the comment section. If Africa built the world once before, what's stopping it from doing it again? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.